Thanks, Dan, and to all the other co-organizers of this really important meeting. And thank you also for inviting me. So, a term I probably don't need to define for this audience, Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies, weird. And when we think about that term, it's really, two kind of macro components, right? The socioeconomic components, and then of course the Western democratic, the more kind of cultural institutions. And often, we think about weird, as Dan just nicely showed in the map, contrasting nation states, especially in North America and Europe, with the so-called kind of more tribal, indigenous, anthropological kind of populations, many of which, like Stephen showcased in his talk yesterday, that differ in very dramatic ways from the weird populations, right, in terms of lower, kind of obvious in certain socioeconomic measures, very different indigenous cultural institutions, and also for many people who are interested in human universals and also thinking about the past, that some of these populations are our best representatives of our pre-industrial past. And so it's a gold mine to focus and study these kinds of populations. And I think Stephen made a good case for that yesterday. Where I'm going to come today is a little bit different, though, which is kind of ironic given that I've spent the last 18 years working with these kinds of populations. I want to actually just ask a general question, where exactly does weird come from? What does it really mean? Whenceforth weirdification? Whoops, skipped. So this general question sort of has existed in various forms in different disciplines. So going back to Ferdinand Tönnies in the 19th century, this contrast between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, the community versus society, thinking about these sort of polar opposites from a very kind of more traditional, non-market economy-based society that's rural, that's more subsistence-based, small scale, face-to-face, kin-based, more mutualistic, interdependent social relationships, maybe lower technology and informal schooling perhaps. And on the other hand, more urban, market-based, consumerism, large scale, interacting in large, perhaps urban settings with strangers, more independence, high tech, and maybe higher levels of schooling. And of course, any population itself, varies along these different dimensions. But this contrast, there's many descriptions of this contrast, but not a whole lot of really detailed kind of theorizing that really kind of thinks about each of these things sort of separately. And I'm going to argue that that's really important, and not only that helps put weird and non-weird populations all kind of in the same map, but will also help with motivate the study of choice populations outside the 68% that Dan showed us. So 3 avenues for really productive possibilities for exploring diversity. Certainly in a cross-section, you can compare populations, however you define that, but also populations over time, because no population is static and unchanging. And so looking at changes in the same population is a ripe opportunity for exploring many of these dimensions and the effects that they have on psychology and behavior, but also people move. So as people move from one place to another, this is another ripe opportunity for exploring these effects. One good example, Patricia Greenfield, not too far from here at UCLA, has a research program that has kind of looked at some of these changing conditions on different aspects of cognition. Has worked in Chiapas for about over 40 years, and comparing from the 60s to the 90s, where mainly subsistence-based agricultural economy was shifting to a more market economy. And then from the 90s to 2010, there was big increases in schooling. And she was interested in weaving patterns and how that affects different aspects of learning and visual representation, and did some experiments showing that over this period of time, from the 60s to the 90s, as the market economy was flourishing, a shift to more independent learning practices, away from more kind of scaffolded guidance and learning from others, more reliance on abstract representation, greater push for innovation, and that these effects were strongest amongst those who were most involved in commerce, and then later on in the 90s to 2010, those involved more heavily in schooling. So shifting to personality, what I want to push for, it's not just, I don't want to say there's no theory, of course, in different areas of social science, but trying to bridge the kind of like first principles ecological evolutionary theory that's rich within the life sciences, to bridge that with the social sciences, to look at the similar questions in psychology and behavior. And so, in personality psychology, there's a lot of frameworks where that are fairly inductive, right? You can measure a lot of things, and you do factor analysis, and things cluster in different ways. And then we try to explain this in some descriptive way. There's certain, very interesting themes in the literature: individualism, collectivism, loose versus tight cultures. Many of you here have done excellent work in these areas. Practice-based influences and how what you do shapes, how you think and deal with the world. And so, kind of bridging a lot of this kind of work together in a with ecological theory is kind of the direction I'd like to push. Often we see ecology or ecological explanations sort of pitted against cultural explanations, which I think, and many others I'm sure would agree, that's sort of a false dichotomy, that if anything, we should expect a lot of times, culture helps us, basically find what might be optimal or close to optimal solutions given a certain ecological environment. And so how can we think about the socio-ecological foundation for explaining population and cultural variation? So there's many different domains to think about. I'm going to try to talk about two today, if time permits. One, the role of unpredictability, environmental harshness on how it shapes time preference and risk, and the other on socio-ecological complexity and how it shapes personality diversification. And the third one I won't talk about, I hope maybe Dan will talk about at some point, or maybe Joe. Okay. So the first one, which comes out of life history theory and evolutionary biology, this idea that if you have a short time horizon, because you don't, say, expect to live very long into the future, you'll put a higher premium on things in the present, short term, over things in the long term. And this is going to reflect both in terms of costs and benefits. So in areas that have higher adult mortality, higher environmental unpredictability, and perceptions, of course, of a harsh future, that you see a push towards more present-oriented time preference. And there's a spat of studies that have linked this idea to lots of different behaviors, from risk-taking behavior, cigarette smoking, drug use, overeating, the kinds of behaviors that give you immediate benefits or short-term benefits, but the costs, in terms of chronic disease risk, et cetera, might be down the road, which you might discount. In the mating domain, earlier first birth, short-term mating, fertility, higher fertility, linked to present-oriented time preference. In the physical domain, less attention to healthcare, less likely to engage in exercise, restrict your diet, etc. So many different domains, but also a lot of psychological dispositions. So present-oriented time preference linked to impulsivity, higher vigilance, low self-control, low self-efficacy, and a more externalized locus of control. And so some of this work has been now kind of under this rubric of the psychology of poverty. But I think, like Dan's saying, this idea of like just focusing on potentially the deficits, as opposed to also thinking about growing up in, say, more stress-adapted environments, how that might actually lead to certain outcomes that aren't just deficits. And a number of people more recently, just in the last 5 years, have, especially Bruce Ellis and Willem Frankenhuis, and others, focusing on some specialized skills and that are sensitized, that often you see come out during stressful events. And so it's not only just that we need to test in different places, but actually testing under different conditions. And so there's really interesting work that suggests that people who kind of raised and under more vulnerable or at-risk conditions actually show some strengths in terms of shifting attention, empathic accuracy or behavioral prediction, enhanced early life memory retention, memory for negative events, rapid tracking in the environment, learning about animal danger, recognition of angry, fearful faces, all the kinds of skills that you would expect to be beneficial if you expect to find yourself in a not so friendly type of environment. And so So just a few quick examples. In Brazil, comparing youth that were living in favelas with similar age-matched university students in Rio de Janeiro, the favela youth discounted the future much more than age-matched folks in school. And they viewed their neighborhoods as more dangerous and with few prospects, and that perception was linked to their discounting of the future. With some of my own work with the Chimane Amerindians in central Bolivia, we found that Chimane have an externalized locus. That means they believe that events sort of outside their control shape what happens to them, and we focus this in terms of their health. And when we compare, obviously with the caveats of comparing things cross-culturally, but using the same instrument in different places that have higher life expectancy, lower mortality, that the Chimane were much less internalized locus and much more externalized locus in UK, Japan, and a couple other places. But more interestingly, what we found was, because I was really interested in why certain people are motivated or not to get healthcare treatment. And it actually turns out, yeah, if you are schooled, that helps a little bit, but it actually doesn't help that much compared to your externalized locus. In other words, if you kind of think it's not necessarily worth it because it's probably not going to make that much difference anyway, that matters a lot more than the kind of knowledge or schooling, which is often the belief that if you only knew that antibiotics had this certain effect, you'd be more inclined to go get yourself to a hospital or a clinic and get treatment. And so we actually found that, and some of the effects of schooling and modernization were actually mediated through these externalized locus beliefs. A paper that just came out last month, a bit correlational, but nonetheless, one of the first things that actually looked kind of cross populations, across countries, a measure of time discounting. Basically, if you could get a certain amount of money this month or a larger amount next month, if we look at what percent of individuals chose next month, so that they were discounting the future less heavily across 46 countries. Basically, in countries with higher life expectancy, we see discounting the future less, so less present-oriented. So again, consistent, controlling for the usual things that you can, at least that you can do in a correlational analysis. Again, it's at least consistent with this idea that even across, many weird countries, you see quite a bit of difference in time preference and presumably all the things that might go along with that. Of course, to get away from some of the correlational issues, there is a growing number of experimental studies. A lot of these are not in humans, though. So just one example, in European starlings, a measure of kind of early life, stress exposure assessed by telomere attrition. These are the caps of your chromosomes. So if they're attriting more rapidly, there's presumably worse environment early on. Those starlings act more impulsively. And further, if they have lower energy reserves, they show steeper discounting. In some experimental work, cues of poverty induce short-term preference in Chinese students. And if you kind of experimentally, to the extent that you can, induce a poverty state, that this led to increased impulsive choices. If you imbue students with power, again, I think we're mostly with students, that also led to lower time discounting. And in the sort of, what practical applications could we have? If you get people to really think about their future self, they call it the vividness of your future self, like you write a letter to yourself in 20 years. There's some virtual reality versions where an aged version of yourself you interact with for an hour. You're less likely to support delinquent behavior, less likely to cheat on a hard trivia exam, and less likely to discount the future. And more comparative stuff looking at income shows again that within, this is World Value Survey data, 43 countries, controlling for the usual things you would try to control for so that you can do comparisons, that within, if you divide income by deciles, that's the x-axis here, that a number of psychological variables vary quite a bit. So locus of control here, so more wealthy within countries, each of these 43 countries essentially showed more internalized locus, more likely to say you would work if you didn't have to. more intrinsic motivation, higher levels of measured generalized trust, more likely to view that helping family members is important, less likely to feel lonely, less likely to feel that life can be meaningless at times. And then these short-sighted is sort of like present-oriented. So you're more likely to be present-oriented, in the lower income strata, and more likely to think risks are worth taking. But this is the kind of risks that, to get what you want, and if you're wealthier, you can be buffered perhaps. So quite a bit of variability within populations. And the same, if you look across populations, you get the similar effects. But the effects aren't quite as strong. But nonetheless, the general point that within and across nation states, there's a lot of variability in many psychological and behavioral variables of interest, varying as a function of the more, I guess I would say, the socioeconomic aspects of weirdness. So the implications is that there's much variation linked to time preference. And so in a theoretically kind of patterned way that varies both within and across populations, and spanning within and among weird populations. And certainly thinking about how that works in terms of ontogeny, these are ripe areas that I think need to be explored. And think about how developmental history, how current lived experience, the pace of change, potential mismatch with early life environments, etc., and the implications all that might have. And how perceptions matter too. Two people in the same environment might perceive, their environment very differently. So how do people choose, what shapes their perceptions? How do you choose reference groups that might impact your perceptions, etc.? And this is, I think, a point Dan made. If we ignore socioecological context, what is a replication? There was a recent study, Van Bavel et al., that the Reproducibility Project, and they had people measure each of the 100 studies with whether they thought context mattered, and it was a big effect. That if context mattered, those studies were less likely to replicate. And so it makes a big difference. A good study by Garcia et al. 2015, Mexico in 1970 in Veracruz versus in 2010, the same exact experiment measuring an aspect of prosociality, very different behavior. And there was a good reason for why people were much less prosocial in 2010 than 1970. So that whole idea that you can't exactly step in the same river twice, that populations over time might vary in interesting ways. So that all takes me to the title of my talk. What about more traditional personality traits, the big five, right, that we all probably know about? OCEAN, right, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism/emotional stability. Often we think about the levels of those traits, and I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to talk about the actual structure of personality. And there's no real consensus on the causal origins of how traits, so trait covariance, the extent to which different traits are related to each other. So there's just a general question, what determines the extent to which distinct aspects of personality covary within individuals, and why do patterns of trait covariation manifest as a certain number of dimensions, whether it's 5, whether it's 2, whether it's 1, whether it's 8. And a typical approach, I think, is this latent variable model approach that, that there's these, psychological constructs in the mind. So assertiveness and sociality are covary because they both feed onto this latent variable called extroversion, which is real. But then at the same time, extroversion itself is sort of inferred from that behavioral covariation and then invoked to explain why those traits might covary. And so there's a bit of circularity such that I don't think there is a really good theory of why Big Five or any particular personality structure might exist. Yet at the same time, from a lot of this literature, because the Big Five have been so widespread, I think there's this understanding or expectation that manifest personality structure will be universal. But the five-factor model isn't really as robust as commonly believed. Certainly it has been replicated in a lot of nation states. And some of these are, typically non-weird countries. But even there, they're done in English or French with university students in African countries. So I was actually looking at personality with the Chimane, and the first thing I found was that the big five didn't replicate. And that wasn't even my goal to do it, but I kind of got stuck in this quandary because just so I could talk about personality with psychologists, the first thing they often want to know is, well, you certainly did the big five. And what I found instead was that there was evidence for a big two, and not the standard kind of big two where the big five kind of cleave into two groups. What we found instead that industriousness and pro-sociality / leadership, if you had to put a label on these traits, seems to define the personality structure of the Chimane. And we did many different tests because the obvious critique was that, well, certainly it's methodological. And that's the standard critique when you don't get the big five, is that it's methodological, it's translation, it's folks are uneducated. But no matter which way we cleaved it, we got the same result. And more recently, similar findings have been found in mostly ethnic group Moray speakers in Burkina Faso, and even from a lexical approach. Gerard Saucier et al. In 12 indigenous languages, found evidence of universality more along these dimensions of dynamism and social self-regulation, which isn't too dissimilar from some of the traits we found. So a different approach based on kind of ecological evolutionary kind of modeling takes a position that the mind is composed of a large number of functionally specific motivational systems, whether it's to accrue status, obtain resources, take care of kids, etc. And that to the extent that behaviors will be that different places have different ways of basically achieving the same kind of functions. Behavior should be correlated when they arise from common or correlated functional motivations. And so we would expect that the contingencies between behavior and outcome is going to vary in different types of environmental contexts. So functional motivations should produce variable behaviors to the extent that conditions vary across contexts. So as a function of the variable input cues and the relationships between behavior and outcomes. So for example, imagine in one place to be high status, you have to social network, you got to be patient with people, and you have to be really good at organizing. Something I imagine actually the organizers here, right, need to have these traits. And so elevated status motivation will generate, under these conditions, robust positive correlations among, say, extroverted and conscientious behaviors. But in another place, imagine high status can be obtained through any one of those separately, just by being good in social networking, just being good at organizing, or other specializations. And under that case, elevated status motivation might elicit more weakly correlated combinations of extroverted and conscientious behaviors. So I think the story of modern history really is characterized by increasing levels of socio-ecological complexity. That is, niche specialization within large-scale cooperative groups and institutions. And you can think this process, it's been spurred way back, if you go to Neolithic agricultural revolution, enabling larger, denser, more stratified and sedentary populations. And that technological and occupational diversity expanded with these demographic changes. So socio-ecological complexity also accelerated further with the industrial and technological revolutions and the expansion of markets in a more monetized economy. So to some extent, to generalize, whereas our foraging ancestors may to some extent be jacks of all trades, residents of more industrialized societies specialize in highly particular roles and rely upon specialists from other households and communities to provide complementary goods and services. And that urbanization will further concentrate large numbers of people in competitive labor, mating, and social markets, which will increase the local density of distinct niches and incentivize the desire to specialize in novel ways. So larger populations with specialization often benefit from greater economic efficiency through economies of scale, so where high volume reduces production costs, and through economies of scope, where payoffs increase from the diversification of goods and services. So we propose that the degree of personality covariation observed within a society will be inversely related to its socio-ecological complexity, with the logic kind of relying on the premise that the number of niches available within a society will correlate positively with the specificity of those niches, and therefore the extent to which phenotypic specialization is an optimal strategy for pursuing one's interests. All right. So as individuals become specialized for different niches within complex societies, the feedback loops, the ontogenetic feedback loops between trait exemplifying behaviors and successful role fulfillment should lead to the development of a correspondingly diverse set of personality profiles. So within less complex societies, individuals might tend to face more similar contingencies, presenting fewer alternatives for how to specialize. So in small-scale societies, people might tend to live in small groups, related and other familiar individuals with reduced choice. In social partners, individuals of the same age and sex might tend to engage in similar forms of subsistence work and exchange. And so achieving success within the fewer available niches may be facilitated by relatively few combinations of behavioral attributes. Okay, so the general main kind of hypothesis, what we call the socio-ecological or niche complexity hypothesis, is that distinct aspects of manifest personality will be more weakly intercorrelated within more complex societies, where again, socio-ecological complexity is defined as the number of specialized social and occupational niches. So one kind of way to try to test this empirically were some work with Aaron Lukaszewski at Cal Fullerton. We need measures of trait covariation. And so, the simplest thing we did was look at places where the Big Five has been measured in lots of different populations using the same instrument. Here, the Big Five instrument. It's a 44-item questionnaire. So we got a sample from Dave Schmidt, 55 countries, over 17,000 people, all using the same instrument. And we just looked at the average correlation across the Big Five. We looked at the specific factor, interfactor correlations too, but I'm just going to talk about the general average. So all else equal, higher correlations means that traits are bundled more closely together, and so you kind of have less of a big, truly independent five, where the correlation is 0. You have, say, truly 5 independent factors. And we have measures for a lot of the things that you would probably want to adjust for when doing these kinds of comparative analyses, differences in sample size for each country, and ways of assessing different types of bias that goes into these types of instruments that are based on self-report. And for socio-ecological complexity, this is sort of just a first-run attempt, and it's mostly sort of getting at one aspect, occupational diversity, perhaps. We did a principal components analysis on Human Development Index, which itself is sort of a function of schooling, life expectancy, and gross domestic product. So a PCA on the development index, urbanization, and sectoral diversity. Sectoral diversity is a measure we got from Harvard's Atlas of what's it called? Economic complexity, I think. Essentially, it's like how many different products and weighting their volume does a country produce. And so all of these loaded, on the first factor of our PCA fairly strongly. So again, we expect lower interfactor correlations in countries defined as more complex. And that is actually what we found, that the correlation was fairly moderate, minus 0.5, that in more complex countries, or countries defined as higher levels of socio-ecological complexity, that they had lower average correlations across their Big Five. So this is sorry in R squared to not have to deal with negatives. But essentially what this is, 0.1, so that's like essentially that the Big Five are about, say 0.3, above 0.3 on average. So it can be fairly high. And again, these are all just 55 countries, right? This is not, we're not even dealing with, groups like the Chimane and other small-scale societies. Although, because we don't have measures on the same metric here, but if we just take the Chimane and the Burkina Faso samples, assuming that there would be kind of on the left end of socio-ecological complexity as we've defined it, they would be all the way up here on the y-axis. So they're consistent with this idea. And when we did more rigorous modeling that adjusted for some of these other factors, the best models all basically included socio-ecological complexity. And if anything, it even maybe strengthened the effect a little bit compared to just the zero order kind of correlation. All right. Since I thought there might be a lot of cross-cultural psychologists in the room, I just quickly, a couple days ago, just to what extent does trait covariance associate with a lot of the types of cultural variables that we've seen, the tightness index, the extent to which countries have strong social norms and don't tolerate deviation very much, that basically personality traits covary more in countries defined as tighter, as countries defined as less individualistic or more collectivistic, countries defined as having higher power distance, so the extent to which folks accept and endorse authority, power differences, and status privileges, countries with less gender equality, gender egalitarianism values, and countries defined as having higher levels of values towards assertiveness. That there's a there, as Clark would say. And at least three of these relationships also held when we adjusted for socio-ecological complexity, which again, I don't mean to say that socio-ecological complexity is everything, but I think there's just a lot of room for really exploring variability even within weird countries and among them. So implications, the big five, not as universal or rigid as commonly believed, that personality structure itself varies, even among weird populations, but there's still a lot of work to be done. One, what are the motivational mechanisms that generate personality covariation? How do state behavior feedback loops calibrate behavioral regulation systems during development, let alone also the methodological issues that involved with really measuring and assessing personality traits in a wide range of environments. And so I think we do need more, I don't know who coined the vital. I saw it in the mission statement, but and I'm not exactly sure what it is, but variable in traditions and life ways types of personality studies. So even if we're looking, in other countries that aren't typically studied, but we shouldn't just, again, focus on the college students in Ethiopia, for example. And that the opportunity for, if what I'm saying about socio-ecological complexity has any validity, that we should even look in the same countries over time and expect to see some differences, or be able to focus on subpopulations and expect to see some differences. And the choice of those populations would be based on having a good theory in the first place to test. So I didn't really talk that much about some of my own work, but much of my work has come out of working with populations of horticulturalists and hunter-gatherers. So the Chimane live in Amazonian Bolivia, and they, in addition to doing farming, they fish, they hunt, and they gather. And they're a good case study I brought them up with respect to saying no evidence for the big five. I talked about their externalized locus of control and how that might matter. But there's a lot of other things that I think are interesting that we wouldn't necessarily have known without looking in depth in a population like this. So minimal infant-directed speech compared to other places and no motherese. No midlife crisis. Depression instead increases with age and really is moderated mediated by physical abilities to do work and be productive. We found no sex or age difference in dead reckoning skills, so an aspect of spatial ability. And last, I'll mention briefly, culture fair tests are highly amenable to schooling effects, and we're seeing huge Flynn effects. So even in the tribal populations, all these groups are undergoing rapid change. And rather than thinking that means, now they're more weird, it's actually, that's great. Now if they're changing, this is a ripe opportunity to understand what's going on in situ. And so with Helen Davis, we took the most culture fair test we could find, the Raven's colored progressive matrices, but it doesn't really matter. We've done other tasks too, and all of them are associated with schooling effects. And so here, just use based on the UK standards. Oh, that skipped one. Yeah, 2007, you can see the circles or the Chimane well below the standards. If we go back to 1947 standards, still well below. If we go to Ghana, a little bit closer, and within in Nigeria sample I found from the 70s, the Hausa showed very similar patterns as the Chimane. So clearly something is there about what exactly is being measured. And yeah, I know all the debates about, this is not a measure of intelligence, but I don't even care about intelligence per se. But, what is it about these tests that seem to be, somewhat culture fair, that individuals can be fully capable and intelligent, in their daily lives, but somehow they're not quite getting it, and schooling is having this effect. What exactly is the effect of schooling, and why is it affecting cognition and performance in this way? And so now we have data over 10 years with over 200 kids, so that we can actually look in a model where we adjust for a number of things that we can basically, and you do the conversion that James Flynn talks about to IQ points, and you can basically, there's been an increase of 9 IQ points per decade. Now, a few recent meta-analyses, when they look at Flynn effects, these are the secular increases in IQ over the 20th century. The average is about 2 to 3 points per decade. So this is, some studies have shown higher, so it's either as high, if not much higher, than other places. So again, a ripe opportunity to think about what's going on, because there's lots of change. There's schooling that's changing, not just the absence and presence, but the quality, nutrition, lower levels of infection, maybe more stimulating environment from TV and other things. One thing I will say, we did a tutorial 1 month later after we tested a bunch of kids, and basically kids got about 14 IQ points higher. So just by kind of learning a little bit about the test, and you were much more likely, sorry, I missed that stop thing. All right, I'm going to finish. So non-weird populations are essential, but not just as exceptions. That, if anything, having a much broader representation of populations, the vital within the weird, and then of course tribal populations, is really grist for the theoretical mill. And when we have good theory, that helps us in choosing populations rather than just saying we need to diversify for diversity's sake, although I do think that can have value too, because we don't always know what's there until we look. And so I tried to talk about 2 theoretical approaches that could be productive, that help try to explain variability within and among populations. But certainly there's a lot of other socio-ecological domains that could matter: inequality, sex ratio, etc. And so lastly, just untapped territory, longitudinal studies in rapidly changing populations and contexts. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry I went over a few minutes, and hopefully I have time for maybe one question. Thank you.